everybody. Okay, I'm going to read you a long book today, so settle in for a good one. It's called Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal, A Tale of Tattletales. Hopefully nobody's tattling at home. I know we're all together a lot. I know my kids are tattling on each other sometimes. It happens. It's okay. It doesn't matter how old you are, right? All right. There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeil's class and 19 tattletales. That's a lot of tattletaling. Dragonflies don't tattletale, do you? It all started when Jessica trotted up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. "Peter pulled my pigtail." "That must have hurt," Mrs. McNeil said. "Did you tell Peter that?" Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeil said, "Let's see what Peter has to say." Peter dragged his hooves all the way to Mrs. McNeil's desk. "Jessica says you pulled her pigtail," Mrs. McNeil said. "I did not," Peter said. "Yes, you did," Jessica said. Uh-oh, that's not helpful. They're not going to get to the bottom of it. What do we tell you guys, dragonflies? Do we say, go talk to him, go tell him that hurt, right? You guys figure it out together. The dragonflies are good at that. "You both have the right to say how you feel," Mrs. McNeil said. "You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that." Mrs. McNeil added, "But since Jessica's tail is still attached and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now." Jessica stomped. Oh, she looks very angry, very upset, and doesn't look like Peter's being very helpful by sticking his tongue out. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeil started humming. "The farmer in the dell, the farmer in the dell." She's trying to keep her calm and her patience. Mrs. McNeil had just lifted her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. "Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times. Mrs. McNeil put down her cup. "Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself first by talking to Rachel." That's what we do, guys, right? She said, "Maybe her ears aren't working too well today. Let's find out." See, he tried to fix the problem by himself before he came and told the teacher. That's what you guys do all of the time. "Stephen can't find his pink marker," Mrs. McNeil said. "Have you seen it?" Yes, sorry, I thought I missed. "I gave it back," Rachel cried. "I can't find my pink marker." "That's because you used it all up," Peter said. "You're always drawing pictures of pigs." Rachel sniffed. "For your information, those are pictures of moi." "What am I supposed to do? Color myself green?" "You know our class rule, Rachel," said Mrs. McNeil. "If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends." So she ran out of her pink marker, so she just took his. What do you think she should maybe have asked? "Excuse me, may I please borrow your marker?" And I bet he would have let her do it right away. Mrs. McNeil had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced. "Frankie called Sookie a fat sow." Oh my goodness, that's not nice. Is it nice to call people names? Mrs. McNeil had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. "I'm glad you know our class rules so well," Mrs. McNeil said. "You're right. We don't call each other names. Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us," Mrs. McNeil said. So this little person, this little piggy, had nothing to do with what the problem was, but he's trying to be helpful. But she's saying, you don't try to fix problems that aren't yours, so let them figure it out on their own. I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Sookie have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, it's my job as the teacher to help them. Your job, Mrs. McNeil added, is to take care of you. That's the most important job you can have. Megan danced a jig all the way back to her desk. But then the stampede started. Robbie breathed on me. Jonathan ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Laura looked at me. Jeremy's grunting and I can't concentrate. Sam's picking his snout. Oh my goodness. Look at all of them. Careful, please. They're all telling on each other, and the poor teacher's like, whoa, 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 whoa.
The word pig?
The students had particularly worn a path to Mrs. McNeil's desk and worn out her patience when she stood up. The students sat down. You're moving the thing, baby. The students sat down. Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new rule to our list, Mrs. McNeil said. A very important rule, she added. Can anyone tell me what squealing is? Students started squealing like their tails were stuck in a gate. Not that kind of squealing, Mrs. McNeil shouted, waving a cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeil continued. Squealing, she said, is my special word for tattling, and I know you know what that is. The new class rule is don't squeal unless it's a big deal. I like that. Some students looked at the floor, some looked at each other, some looked at the ceiling like they're suddenly seeing something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeil started writing on the board. Here's our new class rule, Mrs. McNeil said. What does it mean? Jessica asked. I'm glad you asked, Mrs. McNeil said. To squeal on someone means you go tell a grown-up. When someone does or says something you don't like, instead of telling that person first. Most problems that happen between kids are kid-sized problems. They can work out themselves, Mrs. McNeil said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other. So the teacher's saying most of the time the problems that they all have with each other are problems they can figure out on their own. So they just have to communicate. That means talking to each other, trying to figure out how did I hurt your feelings? Or you hurt my feelings by, and then you can figure it out. But sometimes Mrs. McNeil said something happens that's bigger than a kid-sized problem, like when someone is hurt or in danger. Or when a person is hurting you. Ooh. Or hurting a pet. Awful. Or hurting something that doesn't belong to them or that belongs to all of us. So this guy, he's hurt. That's not a kid-sized problem. That needs an adult. Or when someone's hurting somebody else, you need to tell adult. Or if someone's hurting an animal, that's very unkind. You tell an adult. Or if you see someone hurting something that's not theirs, tell an adult. So she's saying some problems you can't fix on your own. That's when it's okay to squeal, because it is a big deal. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeil, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeil laughed. Well, me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back. Okay, so they're going to go eat now. But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeil had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said Jenny hogged the rope swing at recess. Oh no, she didn't get it. She's still squealing. Mrs. McNeil pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned. Katie nodded. Then you know you need to tell Jenny first about the problem. So first she's saying, go back and tell Jenny, Jenny, I don't like it that you took the rope. That's what she's saying. So go tell Jenny how you feel, just like we do at our school. Tell me what? Jenny yelled from across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn, Jenny said. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. Not this time. It's Caroline's fault, Sookie said. Who's Caroline? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said. So now they're just yelling things out and blaming each other. Thump! Mrs. McNeil had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeil did not answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. Quick, call the office. Tell them it's an emergency. Somebody's got get the nurse. Somebody tell Mrs. Hanlon next door. Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeil in the nurse's office. We're sorry we squealed so much today, Jessica said. We didn't mean to make you mad, Peter said. It's all your fault, Katie cried. It wasn't anybody's fault, Mrs. McNeil said. It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess. We thought you had exploded, Jeremy said. It was pretty gross, Oscar added. Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore, Rachel said. You need to take care of yourself. It sounds like all you took care of the problem, Mrs. McNeil said. Everyone says you knew just what to do when I got hurt. Only because you're such a good teacher, Jessica said. And you're such good learners, Mrs. McNeil said. We still need some practice, Katie said. We all do when we learn something new, Mrs. McNeil said. Let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. Very nice. That was a good book. So remember, try to fix your problem by yourself before you go tell mom and dad. But if it's a big deal, then go tell mom and dad, right? All right, friends. I love you. I miss you. Mwah. We're going to talk to you guys on Friday. Say bye, everybody.
Bye, Zebra.
Have a good day. Bye.